Hi there and welcome to Capital View. The allegations against former IPL chief Lalit Modi and his links with External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj and Rajasthan Chief Minister Vasundhara Raje have pointed to what is being called conflict of interest. Is conflict of interest embedded in our political culture and society? And does there need to be a clear legislation, a law to combat conflict of interest? That's the focus on our episode on this edition of Capital View. With me, Aryama Sundaram, Senior Advocate, Manish Tiwari of the Congress, and Dr. C. Rajkumar, Vice Chancellor of OP Jindal Global University. Thanks everyone very much indeed for being here. Manish Tiwari, let me put it to you at the very outset. Let's leave aside Vasundhara Raje. But if you look at Sushma Swaraj, would you say that this is an issue more of propriety, impropriety and conflict of interest rather than illegality? Because she could argue that there's no quid pro quo, I didn't receive any money, there's no money trail. It is what many are calling conflict of interest, impropriety. Is that where the Sushma Swaraj allegations fit, leaving aside the Vasundhara Raje allegations?
I guess the moot question really is that does this constitute a conflict of interest? And the answer to that clearly is a yes. And to the answer to your earlier question, that whether conflict of interest is embedded into our political culture or for that matter is all pervasive in our governance structure, unfortunately the answer to that is also yes.
Right. So what is then the awareness level within the political class of this conflict of interest? Because this is a moot point. Do politicians act the way they do because they simply don't know what is conflict of interest? Or is it that they believe that conflict of interest is not a bad thing actually? That a politician is supposed to look after his family members, he's supposed to look after his friends?
Well, I think the latter is really true because if someone was to say that he is naive enough not to know as to what the conflict between his public duties and his private persona is, then possibly he lives in cuckoo's land. Because otherwise you can't have airline company owners serving on the Standing Committee of Civil Aviation. You cannot have the employees of petroleum and natural gas companies serving on the Standing Committee of Petroleum and Natural Gas. And obviously you should not have lawyers serving on the Standing Committee of Law and Justice, because though they may bring a certain expertise, but the fact is that it could also constitute a conflict of interest.
Well, and there are many examples from your government where Mr. Dayanidhi Maran was telecom minister when his brother was running a successful television network. Mr. Sharad Pawar had interest in agriculture, but he was, of course, the agriculture minister. Let's put that to Aryama Sundaram. Aryama Sundaram, is this conflict of interest particularly difficult in India because of this Chacha-Bhatija syndrome, the feudal family ties that tie our society together? We're a tightly bound society and therefore almost duty bound to look after each other and look after our feudal relationships. And these feudal relationships override our professional duties.
Look, I wouldn't isolate India into that, because to do so would be to automatically see less in an Indian than one sees in an American or an Englishman, which I am never a party to. The point really is this. You must understand that conflict of interest is basically, essentially a question of fact. You cannot have any hard and fast rule regarding conflict of interest. And let me just give you a very simple example.
You cannot have hard and fast rule.
Let me just give you a very simple example. You have a family of industrialists. You have a big industrial family. You have in that industrial family, one person decides to go into politics. Now, when he enters politics, maybe the Prime Minister would feel that with his knowledge of industry, he would make an excellent industries minister. Now, that in itself, according to me, will not give rise to conflict of interest. We must not forget that we cannot interrelate or we cannot equate conflict of interest with having a general interest. They are two totally different things. The conflict arises in a given fact situation which will present itself very obviously to one, whether there is a conflict which arises here because a decision is being taken, which decision is greatly being motivated by the fact that you have a family member who's going to be directly and majorly affected by the decision. You gave an example of Dayanidhi Maran. Now he has became a minister of something where his brother is also a participant in that industry. That itself would not be a conflict. But assume
why not?
He passed a law.
Why is that not a
Assume
conflict?
he passed a law by which companies with a certain criteria, with certain facilities, with certain things, which absolutely was tailor-made for his brother's company, would get a special benefit. That, of course, would be a question of conflict. So please let us not confuse the two, otherwise we'll throw the baby out with the bathwater.
We can't draw hard and fast rule because having an interest is different from conflict of interest. But
Yes.
we're not even at the stage in India, perhaps, that we are even aware of these niceties that Aryama is talking about. Now, let me put it to you. Would a Sushma Swaraj or a Vasundhara Raje get away, for example, in any other country?
Way back in 2006, Canada had a full-fledged as an act called Conflict of Interest Act. They even have
Canada has a full-fledged act.
Full-fledged act called Conflict of Interest Act. It has an institutional mechanism which will determine what constitutes conflict of interest. It will have disclosure provisions. It will have ethics regulations. It even mentions about the fact that what are the types of conflicts of interest that one should be conscious of, and it also creates an accountability mechanism for these conflict of interest that takes place. So in a way, I mean, we can't predict that if something like this existed. The fact of the matter is we don't have something like that. And I have to say that there is a legislation which has been introduced in the Rajya Sabha. It's a very interesting piece of legislation. I just had a look at it. It's called the Prevention.
There is a legislation.
Yes, well, it's draft legislation. It's a private member's bill has been introduced in Rajya Sabha in the last week of February this year, called the Prevention and Management of Conflict of Interest Bill 2015. Sudarshan Nachiyappan, one of the Congress MPs, has introduced the bill. And that bill actually, very interestingly, envisages a conflict of interest commission. It has details, provisions of what constitutes. It defines, for example, it has drawn upon the OECD definition of what constitutes conflict of interest. It has looked at other countries in the world, including South Africa and the United States, as to how conflict of interest and ethics have been regulated. I strongly believe that a time has come in India for us to really look at a conflict of interest legislation.
Manish Tiwari, you know, when a Hema Malini stands up in Parliament and advocates a water purifier of which she is the brand ambassador, when Mr. Rajiv Shukla, who owns a television channel, is on the Standing Committee of Media, when Mr. Vijay Mallya, who owns an airline, is on the Standing Committee of Civil Aviation, when Mr. N. Srinivasan is the owner of Chennai Super King, and then he's also board secretary of BCCI and board president of BCCI, we're looking at a situation where even if we take Aryama's point that this is that many instances may be interest and not conflict, but this is so rampant in our culture that surely a law is needed.
I completely and absolutely agree with you, and with great respect, I would like to disagree with what Mr. Sundaram said. The fact is, the professor was correctly pointing out the Canadian law. In fact, one of the provisions in the Canadian conflict of interest law is that the public servant or the public person would deliberately ensure or has to ensure that he does not put himself or herself into a conflict of interest situation. And let me give you an example. Way back in 1986, I recall, there was a young deputy minister who was sworn in the Rajiv Gandhi government. He was given the portfolio of textiles, and because his family had interest in textile, he went and told the Prime Minister that I would not like to continue with this portfolio and my portfolio would be changed. It's a and that gentleman in question, you know, subsequently rose to occupy some of the most important positions in this country. So therefore, there is a conflict of interest and there is a perception of conflict of interest, and someone who possibly, you know, comes from an industrial background or comes from an industrial family, and if he is going to preside over the industrial policy of the country, there is a possibility he may have domain expertise, but he is also running into a conflict of interest situation whereby he may be making certain policies which may be benefiting industry at large, but it could also be benefiting an industry in which he could be an equity shareholder or even a sleeping partner. So therefore, the moot point is that you require a very concise, a very properly articulated conflict of interest law which deals with all these situations. Obviously, you know, you cannot deal with each and every situation, but yes, you know, there is a law available which clearly says that if a public servant puts himself into a conflict of interest situation, he is liable and therefore he will be prosecuted.
Right. So you're saying Parliament should actually frame rules and regulations on conflict of interest?
A law. A legislation.
A law. There should actually be a law. Aryama, let me get you to respond to what Manish Tiwari is saying, that, you're saying domain expertise is not conflict of interest. But, on the other hand, you have a situation where Bill Clinton, for example, the former US president, has actually said that he will accept no speaking assignments if Hillary Clinton were to become the president of the US. So that shows an awareness of conflict of interest, because he's afraid that if he accepts speaking assignments, that could become a pressure point on her. Now, in India, no politician would ever do that. And these matters are simply not open in the public domain at all. So do you believe that the awareness is missing? And until the awareness is missing, we need a law.
Before you go to Mr. Sundaram, Sagarika, may I point out that if you read the book Clinton's Cash, in fact, Bill Clinton did exactly to the contrary. When she was Secretary of State, he accepted speaking engagements, which actually earned him a huge FT fee.
But he's now said that he will accept no speaking
Possibly
assignments
after the book has come out.
if she becomes president, perhaps after the book has come out. But Aryama, respond to that. Should there be a declaration? Should someone who is now accepting a public post or accepting a professional post declare that these are my interests? Should there be an open declaration of some kind?
Oh yes, that I'm fully in agreement with. You see, a declaration of interest is absolutely required. You have it even under the Companies Act. A director on a board has to declare his interest, that I have an interest in a given subject matter. Now, that does not mean a conflict of interest. That is what I'm saying. We're confusing completely. I'm afraid I cannot agree with my friend Manish on this account. Let me explain why. Two reasons. Number one, why should we throw out talent merely because that person already has a lot of experience and knowledge in a field? Should we not try to harness it and use it for the country? Rather than saying, because you have a lot of knowledge and expertise in this, which we could have used for the country, but for that very same reason that you have the knowledge and expertise, we will make you eschew from this very subject matter. That way we don't get the best person for the best job.
Section 13 in the Prevention of Corruption Act says that if a public servant, there is criminal misconduct by a public servant if he, by corrupt or illegal means, obtains for himself or any other person any valuable thing. So the fact is, if Ms. Sushma Swaraj, who is a public servant, has obtained for Mr. Lalit Modi a valuable thing, which is a passport, then according to the Prevention of Corruption Act, that is criminal misconduct. So there's already a law. Do you believe that law is not enough?
No, the law is one of the problems of any Anti-Bribery and Prevention of Corruption Act all over the world is the burden of proof that is required to prove is very high. And one of the reasons why there's a low conviction rate in anti-corruption cases in our country is because the fact it's very difficult to establish that, that exactly the provisions.
It's difficult to
in fact,
establish this.
Section 9 of the Prevention of Corruption Act talks about gratification of any kind. It actually is a much more wider catch-all provision. But where I slightly have a different view, with all due respect to Mr. Aryama, is the fact that I think we shouldn't be, one of the reasons why we need to have a conflict of interest law is to establish what constitutes conflict of interest. Many a time what's happening in today's discourse, including in media discourse, is the fact that we kind of misunderstand, any possibility of an affiliation or an interest or an association to be a major conflict of interest violation. That may not be the case. In fact, my own view is a conflict of interest legislation, if well drafted, with provisions of a mechanism which will actually determine what constitutes conflict of interest, and with due provisions for public disclosure as to what these conflicts are, will actually help us, differentiate aspects which are not really
between someone who's giving a favor to his institution or giving a favor to his family. I think that's the issue, because if you have someone expert in industry who's coming as industry minister, it's okay if he's giving favors to industry. What if he's giving it to individual family members? That is what is the problem.
That is a conflict.
That is a problem. But that's what we need to define.
That is what I told you as an example the first time I addressed you.
Right. I'm going to have to take a short break at this point. Let's take a short break at this point and come back with lots more on the other side on whether we need this law on conflict of interest or whether a law will actually only drive the practice underground, as often happens in India. That's after the break. Welcome back to Capital View. We're asking, in the wake of the allegations of Lalit Modi's links with Sushma Swaraj and Vasundhara Raje, is India ready for a conflict of interest law? Is it necessary to have a legislation to stop these kind of actions by public servants? Manish, Tiwari, respond to what Rajkumar is saying, that basically what happens is, if we follow Aryama's suggestion, that of course people with domain expertise can be brought in as public servants in that particular field, but often they give favors to their sons and their nephews and their daughters and their sons-in-law. It doesn't go to the institution. That's the problem in India.
Well, you see, there you are talking about not a conflict of interest, but there, you're talking about nepotism. You know, that's a deliberate, intentional act in order to do a favor to a son or a daughter or a nephew or any relative. But the point that I'm trying to make is a little more subtle than that. For example, if you have domain knowledge in industry, and you also know that there is a Conflict of Interest Act which is there on the statute, you will walk the extra mile to ensure that you don't perjure yourself. You do not put yourself in a conflict of interest situation. So it will act as a deterrent, it will act as a benchmark or a marker. It will not disqualify people who have domain knowledge from coming into a particular area. The next point, the next point is that conflict of interest often is not only a pecuniary benefit. A conflict of interest could also be that, for example, if you've handled your matter in your professional capacity, and then if you're handling a policy decision with regard to that possible area or that possible domain, and it ends up giving a benefit or a bonanza to the industry as a whole, once you get back to your profession, you know, you can always leverage it for your private benefit. So therefore,
that's always the issue. That's always the issue, isn't it? That what you've given as a public servant, you can then leverage that once you get back to your profession. You wanted to come in there.
I just want to quickly mention that one of the distinctions we need to make is that it's entirely possible that we will miss the expertise of certain individuals to serve in certain committees and bodies by recognizing that conflict of interest will not allow them. But that's actually part of the process. In fact, for example, remember there was an incident recently where one of the MPs who had a major tobacco company was also serving in the Parliamentary Standing Committee relating to health and safety and tobacco issues. And now clearly, this person will not be able to objectively exercise his responsibilities as a member of the committee, having been, although he will be aware of the tobacco industry and whatever. My point is, there are enough people who could be involved. So what we are trying to say is that the idea of conflict of interest law is to ensure that such people do not serve in these committees when their public responsibilities as public officials
should not serve in these
conflict
committees
with private interests.
Respond to what Manish Tiwari is saying, that a law would be a deterrence against giving favors to your family.
You are again going back to this issue of we are going on a basis that we need deterrence for our public servants. I mean, it's a very unfortunate situation, really. This really reflects very badly on, unfortunately, maybe the public servants have brought it on themselves. The way we look at them, that we need a deterrent because we assume that sans deterrent, they will violate the law, they will help themselves. And that is a very unfortunate situation. I'm saying instead, punish strongly for a transgression of the law.
But
punish strongly when you find that there is a favor given where it shouldn't be called for. Today you have ministers who in the open, open to the entire country, there have been various questions raised, but they are sitting there very strong and not bothering to move. And tomorrow, if you bring in a law, they will still continue there saying that until I am actually charged and convicted, until I am convicted and sentenced, I don't have the law.
See, let's be very clear about one thing that we are, I am not suggesting as a lawyer and a law professor, I'm conscious that law cannot be a panacea for all ills, and law is one of the important social institutions which can regulate human behavior. But having said that, it is all the more important that we need a conflict of interest legislation because we are still evolving as a society to establish rule of law.
But why not simply implement the provisions of the Prevention of Corruption Act?
No, but
very strictly and punish people and give exemplary punishment.
It is over 65 years of our experience that the fact remains. I mean, the evolution of Prevention of Corruption Act has only led to our struggle to establish a Lokpal. And you and I know that even after the Lokpal bill being passed and become an act, even after we have not even able to constitute the Lokpal, we have not been able to ensure that the Lokpal begins functioning. So let us at least recognize that we have seen high levels of political, bureaucratic and other forms of corruption deeply embedded into every aspect of power and exercise of power in our country.
Right.
So the
Sagarika,
idea
can I
of
ask
a
the
conflict
professor
of
a
interest
question?
law
Yeah, go
comes
ahead.
in that context.
Aryama wants to ask you a question.
Professor,
go ahead,
you
Aryama.
feel that the existing law, even though it could cover the issue, people are getting away from it. What makes you feel that the new law, you keep multiplying the laws, and why should you not have the same result? Because even if you have your conflict of interest law, which basically is punishable if you act in certain ways, tomorrow it's the same degree of proof, it's the same situation all over again. Are you not multiplying the issue instead of tackling what has to be tackled?
Instead of implementing the law, why are we having
public
another
opinion going against these
the
people and propriety once again being injected into political life. That is
Sagarika,
more
may I
important.
come in for a moment?
Yeah, very quickly.
You know, this whole thing works in a much more subtle and a much more nuanced manner. The difficulty with somebody serving on a standing committee in an area in which he has interests, it is not a direct quid pro quo, which often works at times. The mere membership of that committee, allows the person to drive policy in a particular manner. So therefore, you are not looking for a special dispensation for your own interests. But
are politicians particularly guilty? Are politicians particularly guilty? Because in the judiciary, Manish, allow me to point out.
One second. Sagarika, it is not only the politicians, even the bureaucrats. For example, you may have a son or you may have a daughter who's serving in a particular industry, and you have a secretary in the government of India or a joint secretary who's dealing with the same matter. Does that not constitute a conflict of interest?
Let me just get you in here to respond to what Manish Tiwari again said law is a deterrent, but Aryama saying if Prevention of Corruption Act is not a deterrent, then how can this be a deterrent?
One of the reasons why the Prevention of Corruption Act has not fulfilled the purpose of the act was it was a poorly drafted legislation. It did not have a proper independent institutional framework which allow the fight against corruption effectively. The effort to in many ways bring forward a better framework was through the Lokpal. And if you look at, I think life of law is not logic but also experience. So if you look at countries around the world, one of the things they've done is they've constantly attempted to reform and reinvent and even inject new legislative and institutional frameworks with a view to fighting issues related to corruption as well as conflicts of interest. And one of the efforts is how do we make the legislation much more effective. And I agree with Mr. Aryama that if we end up drafting a poor legislation, it will not be effective. It all depends on the
legislation.
It also depends.
It all depends on the legislation, and it needs to be a good legislation.
It will also depend upon, for example, if you remember the Right to Information Act, that's an example of how a legislation can actually seek transformation in relation to seeking transparency and accountability. Now, there were a lot of skepticism even at that time.
On the Prevention of Corruption Act, also, what is being said is not entirely correct. If you look at the statistics, the CBI has a conviction rate of about 63% when I looked at it. And in trap cases, it is as high as 99%. So to say that the Prevention of Corruption Act has not worked would be incorrect.
Aryama Sundaram, do you want to quickly respond to that? It has worked.
I certainly think so. And if you feel that the Prevention of Corruption Act is drafted in a loose manner, then please amend that. Amend it accordingly. Bring into force all that you really intend to do.
The answer is not in a law on conflict of interest. It's on the implementation of the existing law, is the view of Aryama Sundaram, senior advocate. But on the other hand, Manish Tiwari of the Congress and C. Kumar, Vice Chancellor of Jindal University, are saying we need a law of conflict of interest precisely because in India there is no awareness even that there is conflict of interest when it occurs. Fascinating subject. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you very much to all my guests for joining me. That's it on this edition of Capital View. We're back next Friday. Don't forget to tune in.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.